welcome you once again to our continuing discussion of the Scriptures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joining me for our discussion today are three members of the Brigham Young University Department of Ancient Scripture faculty. Seated to my left is Professor Richard Draper. Richard, good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Across the table from me is Professor Eric Huntsman. Eric, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Terry.
And seated to my right is Professor Ray Huntington. Ray, looking forward to your input today.
Thank you, Terry.
Today we get to discuss, we're returning to some history text. We're going to talk about 1 Kings beginning with chapter 12. Now, for those who have been watching these broadcasts, they probably noticed that we started the book of 1 Kings, and then we took a break and looked at some of the wisdom literature, Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and they may be wondering, why did you do that? Why did we take a break from the history and go to the wisdom literature right there?
It's because we've got some of the kings, particularly Solomon, who has the reputation of being very wise. And therefore, at this particular point, we can see this wisdom literature being collected as part of the corpus now of biblical materials.
So we looked at those that are attributed to these wise kings, David and Solomon, and now we're going to return for the rest of the story. Meanwhile, what's happening back at the farms, kind of a thing.
Of course, this is one of the ironies because David and Solomon both weren't very wise. I mean, regardless of what wisdom they had, they didn't always use it correctly, and we're going to see the repercussions of their choices in the chapters today.
Maybe it'd be helpful for the audience if we just took a few moments to kind of review what's happened historically here then. At the beginning of 1 Kings, we have the last of the judges, Samuel, and we know that Israel decides they want to have a king so they can be like
Everybody else.
All the other nations, and they give into that political, social pressure. And God does him a good favor, doesn't he? He calls a remarkable man to be a king, the goodliest man that he could find, who was head and shoulders above all the rest, even Saul. And he starts off so wonderfully, and then
Doesn't make it.
starts relying on his own wisdom, stops trusting in God, starts thinking, gets proud, gets jealous, gets paranoid, and falls out of good standing. So God chooses a successor, a man after his own heart, even David. And David's, it's the same paradigm, isn't it? What a remarkable man. The one who could access the powers of heaven and slay Goliath, totally true and faithful to Jehovah and to King Saul, and then the same mistakes. As he starts to lean to his own understanding, as he starts to think that he's above the commandments of God, he commits adultery, he commits murder, and at the end of the text we see that he's become really a moral coward. He can't even make hard decisions.
Yeah. It's an interesting pattern, Terry. It's the two faces of Saul, the two faces of David, the two faces of Solomon, and the message is pretty clear that life is meant to be lived. It's also meant to be endured, that we ought to endure well to the end. The life here, these are men that did not endure. They didn't live life as they should have in their later years.
And if I could jump in, it's interesting that some could accuse God of sabotage. God didn't want them to have a king, and therefore he chose bad kings. But the text belies that. What the text says to me is that, first of all, he picked Saul, and Saul looks like a king. I mean, he's a head taller than every other man in Israel. He is good-looking. He has the bearing, and initially he even has the humility. And so this good-looking man who looks like a king fails. Who does God pick next? David, who doesn't look like, in my estimation.
But he's a man after God's heart.
Exactly right.
Inside component.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We don't look at the exterior failed, so now let's go to the interior. And the interior fails, the heart fails, okay? So where do we go next? We go to Solomon, who's the mind. Mm-hmm. So God gave him the best of the physical realm, the best of the emotional realm, the best of the intellectual realm. He gave them the best, and they all failed, and thus it shows the wisdom of God.
Yeah, well summarized.
Yep.
We know that towards the end of Solomon's reign, a prophet approaches another man from the kingdom of Israel. His name in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, verse 11, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the Ephrathite. And the prophet Ahiah comes to him. That's an interesting name. Ahiah means Jehovah's brother. Well, there's a theology in that name, isn't there?
It really is.
There really is. Anyway, he asked him for his coat. And I guess you really shouldn't give your coat to a prophet if you want to keep it in good shape. Because what does he do with it?
Rips it up into 12 pieces.
And gives 10 to Jeroboam. And the other 2 he retains. And what do the 10 pieces represent?
10 tribes that are going to go with Jeroboam in his eventually successful revolt. Doesn't happen quite yet.
And of course, when Solomon finds out that there's someone else who's laying claim or may lay claim to the throne, Jeroboam is forced to flee to Egypt for a while. Solomon gets time to finishing his mortal sojourn, and he is appointed as heir apparent to this fellow named Rehoboam. And we're in chapter 12 now of 1 Kings. Rehoboam goes to Shechem, kind of a centralized location in the kingdom.
Well, and some people see that as actually a play to these northern tribes that may already have been somewhat rebellious. I mean, that's up in Ephraim territory, isn't it? And it's up in the northern part, and having all the tribes come to a traditional site instead of the city of David may have been some attempt to placate the northern tribes.
I think you can be a little more sure than that. I appreciate the fact that you don't want to set everything in cement, but there's no doubt that the northern tribes, even at this point, really feel that they have borne the burden of Solomon's administration. They are not very happy people.
They've borne 10/12 of it anyway.
That's exactly right.
And of course, the bureaucracy grew incredibly under Solomon. Samuel had warned such would happen, and it did happen. But they're not happy with it now.
No.
They're not glad that they had a king like all the other nations. But Rehoboam has a chance when he gets there, right? A chance to maintain their alliance and to keep the kingdom together. And they make a request. Why don't you read verse 4 for us, Ray? Would you do that for us?
Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke, which he put upon us, lighter. We will serve thee. I mean, they're willing right there and then to acquiesce to him as king. If he'll make the service lighter. I think people don't realize that, and Richard referred to it, the kind of ruler that Solomon was as he lived out that latter part of his life. He had developed what in terms have been referred to as the corvée. Which was nothing more than slavery.
Right. I mean, it's not just high taxes. This is what 1 out of 3 months they had to serve.
Exactly. He's taking people out of the fields, out of their homes, men, women, and he's putting them into his service without pay. They're going to build his chariot cities. They're going to market his grain. They're going to harvest his crops. And the interesting fact here is that he picks on all of the tribes,
Except
but one,
Judah.
and it's Judah. That's his tribe. He leaves that untouched. And
It would be interesting if he'd had his large place of Nephi and could have read about King Benjamin.
exactly.
This story would be very different if he had understood the principle of servant leadership.
Exactly.
And apparently the misunderstanding of that principle, or the lack of the understanding of that principle, persisted in his son Rehoboam. It would seem to be a no-brainer. Rehoboam will be with you, will serve you, will stay with you if you would just reduce the taxes, give us a tax cut, if you will.
Make us serve 1 month out of 12
Exactly.
instead of 1 out of 4.
Now, in fairness to him, he doesn't seem to know what to do, so what decision to make, so what does he do?
He talks to 2 different groups of advisors. He calls the old counselors, the people who had been the advisors of Solomon, and they said that's a good idea. Early in your administration, make some concessions. And then he calls in what are described as the young men, and
That were growing up with him.
Right, and they tell him, wow, we've got the power now, let's enjoy it. And they suggest that they go back and say, be tough with these tribes so they won't be rebellious, and say, well, my father's yoke was the size of my little finger, and I'm going to make it as big as my thigh. So I'm going to raise your service obligations and your taxes.
There's a real principle taught in that response, because we know that Rehoboam listens to the younger ones instead of the older ones. And somewhere along the line, his dad had failed to teach him the importance of being source critical. That not every source of information is reliable as the others. And at this point, I think it's important to stress that when we're looking for the kind of people we are comfortable taking counsel from, we need to make sure it's people who are smart enough to be counseling us. It's people who share the proper goals and values, and it's people who care about us. And those kind of people we ought to take counsel from. And these young men, they weren't smart enough. They were raised thinking that life owed them a living. The whole people were supposed to support them. They didn't have the same goals and values, the righteous goals and values that the Lord would have for them. And they certainly didn't care more about Solomon. They were just trying to get, or rather Rehoboam, they were just trying to get all they could out of it. So,
There's another great lesson here too, and that is, look at the quorum of the 12 today, and the accumulated experience that you have. Those are older men.
Well, in conference, once President Packer added up all their ages.
Exactly, he added the ages.
Cumulative years of
and
wisdom.
the cumulative years of wisdom, and also he spoke about having the seniors serve. There's something about having an older man or woman serving the young men or young women. They can bring that wealth of experience to bear on youth. And unfortunately, Rehoboam is not smart enough to recognize that here. Now, he's not going to listen to these older men who have this wealth of experience. I mean, they served under Solomon. They could clearly see what was happening.
Well, it's interesting, coming out of the wisdom literatures we just had, we've talked about texts that laid out how you are successful in life, and now we are going to see a living example of people who don't follow those principles and the results of that.
and so Rehoboam listens to the younger men. He tells Israel, I'm not going to lower your taxes. I'm going to raise them. And
Chastise you with scorpions.
and Israel revolts. And look at the tragedy that follows.
So smart.
As a parent, you ought to teach this to your kids in home evening, because in every kid's life there comes a point where their friends know more than mom and dad. And what a wonderful thing if they've been taught this story, and when they start making those decisions, you can, as a parent, you can put your arm around your son and say, "Tell me again what you just said, Rehoboam."
Yeah.
I can see my wife's eyebrows raising, and I say, today we're going to talk about 1 Kings 12 and family night.
Well, it's a great message, and if you teach that to them when they're young, they'll know the message. All you have to do is say Rehoboam, and they'll know.
And I would like to, if you don't mind just kind of pressing on, there is another lesson in chapter 12 that I really like, and it's in verse 15. Wherefore the king hearkened not unto the people, and then this very interesting phrase, for the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform his saying, which the Lord spake unto Ahijah the Shilonite, unto Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The one thing that the writer of Kings never lets us forget, and that is God is behind everything that's going on. Now, the Hebrews, the Israelites, do not have the same issue with agency that we have, because they were not tainted by Greek philosophy, didn't have to worry about that. Sorry about that. Yeah, the downfall of everything. But anyway, the point is that they see God working through this whole thing, and therefore it's kind of a message to the reader. Watch how the hand of God moves through all of this thing and learn the lesson.
Yeah.
And there's a lesson that we need.
One
to
of the things
learn.
that is interesting to me, though, is David falls, Solomon fails, Rehoboam loses almost everything. But in all of these stories, the mercy of God is still intact. How often do we see, for the sake of my servant David, I'm going to give you another chance? In Solomon, I'm not going to take the kingdom from you. In your life, your son will lose part of it. But then Rehoboam keeps 2 of the 12 parts. And that line persists. The Lord is gracious and merciful, and he puts up with it really as long as he can. And that's a nice lesson, because he's pretty tolerant with us. There's no excuse for sin. Mm-hmm. But we know that he's always going to be reaching out, and that he's always going to want to forgive if we'll repent.
I think one of the great lessons here, besides the ones you've pointed out, is also the lesson of what one righteous man can do and how that filters through and spills out in the lives of many other, like a King Benjamin. But conversely, what one wicked man can do and how that spills out.
That's a good Book of Mormon lesson.
It is, the ripple effect. And boy, you see this with both Jeroboam and Rehoboam. In the case of Jeroboam, he had an opportunity to first of all, he was placed there by prophecy, revelation, and God's hand. And yet he makes a choice here that he's going to take his nation down that path of apostasy, and they will never recover from it. Never.
Why don't you explain a little bit more exactly how he took the nation down the road of apostasy? We know that they broke up after Rehoboam refused to lessen the taxes.
King of the north.
They were going to go to war, and the Lord forbids them from doing it right up front.
We're not going to shed blood here.
So Jeroboam now is established as the king over the northern tribes, and you think this is going to be great, a prophet chosen king, and then...
Well, he has a concern, and one of the concerns is Jerusalem, Jerusalem. that's the spiritual center of Israelite worship. It's the place of the temple. It's a grand city. And his concern is that his people are going to flock down there. And in fact, some of them did. Mm-hmm. Some of them did leave his kingdom, and he's a little worried about that. And therefore, he wants to entice them by, in a sense, setting up a state religion, something that's going to keep them up north. And so he establishes what you would call cultic centers, one in Dan at the north, and one close to the borders between now Judah and Israel in Bethel. We don't know a lot about them except what is described in chapter 12,
Well, our editor is
verse
pretty
28.
negative on it, so
Yes,
we don't get a
big
clear
time.
picture of what's
Yeah.
going on.
But I would like to just underscore the statement that you made, and that is what he is doing is setting up a state religion.
Yes.
He's putting the muscle of the state behind the worship of idols.
Yes.
You know, I've always wondered why he didn't build an altar where they could worship Jehovah and have Levites working and something that was acceptable to the Lord, whatever these things were. Obviously, he didn't fast and pray about this decision.
Oh, no.
He just thought in his own mind, this is what I ought to do, and then he proceeded without God's blessing in the work, and that was the
Well,
huge
and you know,
mistake.
it's interesting because whether it manifests itself in people's individual lives, their family relationships, or in the political scene, the cardinal sin of the Old Testament is unfaithfulness. And whether it be literal adultery, David and Bathsheba, or whether it be spiritual adultery, turning away from a covenant relationship with the Lord, it's the same thing. And chapter 11, when we saw Solomon on his way down, he loved many strange women, and he's being unfaithful to the Lord in a kind of a sexual way. But now Jeroboam is doing the same thing in a spiritual way.
Good point.
I like chapter 13, verse 33 and 34. It's kind of a summary going on here. And after these things, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people priests of the high places. Whosoever would, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And this thing became sin unto the house of Jeroboam, even to cut it off and to destroy it from off the face of
Well, and
the
that
earth.
becomes a refrain throughout 1st and 2nd Kings. Even when you change dynasties in the north, they'll say they didn't turn from the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Even if they do go away from Baal or from other gods, there's this sense of unauthorized or improper worship of the Lord.
Yeah, they've got the wrong
yes.
priests in there.
It's the continuation of a state church, funded, supported, and mandated by the state as well. But you know, another thing that I think is important, some have asked, why were these so enticing? Well, what was the power behind it? And I think it's important to understand that these high places may have been also no more than houses of prostitution. And that was
Because of fertility cults. and
the
other kinds of
fertility
religious
cults. It was extremely inviting to the Israelites, and it perpetuated itself for years and years and years.
Now, Jeroboam can't plead ignorance. You know, I didn't know this was wrong, because in chapter 13, God sends a prophet to let him know and to give him a miraculous, a powerful sign that you're out of line here, fella. So the prophet comes, and he
Not
lets him
named.
know.
He's just a man of God. He's kind of left them
Verse
anonymous.
2 of chapter 13. Here's the prophet, and here's the message he gives. He cried against the altar. This is the altar that Jeroboam has set up
in Bethel.
and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. This is interesting. We're given his surname right at the very beginning. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. Now the footnote in the LDS edition of the King James Version, footnote 13.2a, refers you to 2 Kings 23, where that prophecy
Right.
is fulfilled. Exactly.
And burning the bones, we should explain, that's to defile the altar. Even for pagans, they didn't want to burn bones, so that was to make it not good for any kind of worship.
And then as an immediate sign, he says this altar is going to be torn in two. And Jeroboam panics. He reaches his hand out to try and stop this, and
Withers.
yeah, it withers, and then all of a
Can't
sudden
pull it
he
back.
decides to repent. Please fix my hand. But the altar's rent, his hand is fixed, and he just lets him know this is going to happen. You think the next verse would say, and Jeroboam repented in sackcloth and ashes, but
You'd think
not.
so.
You
I mean,
would
this is a
think.
tremendous sign.
there's a rather disturbing issue, and maybe we ought to talk about it just real quickly at the end of this chapter, chapter 13. This prophet who gave the sign to Jeroboam is going home. He'd been commanded of the Lord, don't dilly-dally, don't stop and eat with anybody, don't spend the night anywhere, just get straight home. And on the way home, what happens?
Well, there's this old prophet. We don't know if he was actually a prophet of Jehovah or whether he was someone somehow associated with the Bethel cult. But there's this old prophet who lived there, and he says, oh, here's a man of God. And he sends his sons out to invite this man of God who's worked the sign to come stay with him, eat, etc. And at first, the man of God says, I'm not going to. An angel told me what to do, not to eat anything, not to drink anything. But this old prophet entices him to come back and to break the commandment he had received.
Yeah. And as a consequence of that, the prophet is killed by a lion.
Yeah.
Now, you just read this to your children at home evening, and they look at you like they always do with adoring eyes, and they say, Father dear, what is the principle or truth I should learn from this story? What are you going to tell them?
I believe that there is the one overreaching sentiment within this thing comes out of verse 21 that says, Thus saith the Lord, for as much as thou hast disobeyed the mouth of the Lord, and hast not kept the commandments which the Lord thy God commanded thee, but camest back. He disobeyed. Now we could plead, gee, he was seduced. This other prophet said, I've seen an angel. The angel said it's all right to come and eat with me. But the truth of the matter was, this person had the word from God's very mouth.
And he shouldn't have had to receive it through some other agency.
That's exactly right. He shouldn't have had an agent, a different agent, cancel the Lord's own commandment. So that's where he's culpable.
Yeah, so the point here then, just kind of paraphrasing it, is we don't let other people talk us out of doing what we know is God's will. There's lots that will want to, and they'll use all kinds of trickery to do that. You know, you teach your kids that, and then when their friends say, no, God really wants you to go see this R-rated movie, they'll look at their friend and
I don't
they'll
want
say,
to be killed by a lion.
Yeah, I don't want to get killed by a lion. And they'll say, what? And they'll have a great chance to teach. There's so many wonderful stories that teach and have such great applications.
You know, one of the applications as well with that story is that later in the text, as we get down into the minor prophets and the later history of Judah, one of the condemnations, well, of both Judah and Israel is how the people dealt with those that God had set apart to do his work, the Nazarites. And later the condemnation, I think it's from Amos, who said, you've commanded the Nazarites, you've commanded the prophets not to prophesy, and you've given the Nazarites drink to drink, wine to drink. You've corrupted them. You've tried to take them away from their mission. And I think that's essentially what's going on here, as Richard points out.
Yeah, and you know, the north is guilty, Samaria is guilty, but the south is also guilty. Chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. And Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins, which they had committed above all their fathers had done, for they also built him high places and images and groves on every hill and under every green tree. And there were also sodomites in the land. It's interesting that of all of the perversions, the sexual perversions, the author picks up sodomy. As
these were probably associated as the other kind of ritual prostitution were with fertility cults.
Yeah. Certainly Israel didn't have a corner on the market of wicked kings.
No.
In fact, if you count them up, I did this once, and starting from Rehoboam and Jeroboam, we'll find that Judah will have 20 kings, but last 150 years longer before they're carried away into Babylon. And
18 are bad.
And Israel has 19.
Okay, so
Israel never has a righteous king.
Isn't that interesting?
Never has a righteous king. Judah has 8. And the righteous kings usually live longer, and the kingdom lasts longer.
Yeah.
Chapter 14, I think we see something happening at the beginning of this chapter. Jeroboam has estranged himself from God. He's not going to listen to his prophets until trouble hits him close at home. And then all of a sudden, now I want the prophet's help. His child is sick, but he doesn't even have the confidence to go to God, to go to the prophet to ask for help. So he tries to disguise his wife. How does that work?
Not very well.
Not well.
Very poorly. Isn't it interesting? He doesn't have the confidence for himself to go to the prophet, but he also feels it necessary to disguise his wife. I mean, he doesn't. It's a testimony how far he feels he has fallen. But you can't fool God. I mean, here we have this blind prophet.
And he
the guy's
still knows
blind,
this.
and she walks in, and he says, "What are you doing?"
Wife of Jeroboam, is your child sick?
That's exactly right. You know. And then, of course, this very ugly prophecy in verse 7, "Go tell Jeroboam, thus saith the Lord of Israel, forasmuch as I exalted thee from among the people and made thee prince over the people of Israel, and rent the kingdom away from my servant David and gave it thee, and yet thou hast not been as my servant David." And then verse 9, "But hast done evil above all that went before thee, for thou hast gone and made other groves." And then the end is, "Your child will die as soon as you, the wife, step inside. Your child is dead."
You know, I want to follow up something you said, Richard. I think it's important. This concept here, or this story of a lack of confidence, disguising his wife, trying to get a blessing through ulterior means, we can learn a great lesson from that. In section 121, verse 45, "Let thy bowels also be full of charity towards all men, and to the household of faith let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly," something that evidently Jeroboam wasn't involved in.
Yeah.
"Then shall thy confidence wax strong in the presence of God." You can go to him boldly and plead
Ask
for a
for
blessing,
yourself, right.
and it'll happen. According to the Lord's will, it'll happen.
Because of his sins, Jeroboam is removed. Eventually, the dynasty that replaces him is the Omridic dynasty, equally as wicked and perhaps even more so. Because when Omri becomes the king, they start to bring in more apostasy, and eventually his son, Ahab, will marry Jezebel and make Baalism the state religion of Israel. At the same time, there are wicked kings who are ruling in Judah and trouble there. And the message is God will not allow a covenant people to prosper in sin.
Good point.
For more information on this program, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org.